as we gather together today to celebrate Good Friday. You might say, what is good about the day that Jesus gave up his life on the cross? Well, you see, actually, Good Friday is the fulfillment of thousands of years of prophecy. It was what the patriarchs of old had waited for. It was what the prophets of centuries before had prophesied. They had been waiting for this day of redemption. You see, Isaiah 53, which was written 700 BCE, almost 700 years before Jesus was even born, Isaiah prophesied that the Messiah would come, that the Son of God would come, and what it would look like for him. And actually, this very passage, Isaiah 53, has been removed from the weekly synagogue readings because of the controversy that it brought out. And so they just said, let's just cut it out completely. But this very day, more than 2,000 years ago, was prophesied thousands of years before. That a man would come and he would suffer for our sins, for our mistakes, for all the wrong things we had done. And we're going to pick up the story this morning in we're going to pick up the story today in John 18. Starting at verse 1. I'm going to read John 18, 1 to 14.
When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place, because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Then the detachment of soldiers, with its commander and the Jewish officials, arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people.
You see, in this moment, people come before Jesus and he declares, I am he. And maybe this will be reminiscent for them. Remember that the Jewish people are just in the midst, just starting off the Passover celebration. The Passover is the celebration of the Jews' freedom from Egypt. How I am delivered them. As he was revealed to Moses, delivered them from Egypt, from oppression and from slavery. And as Moses in Exodus stands before the burning bush, and he says, who are you? Who am I to say you are? God says, I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. The great I am. And here in the beginning of the Passover celebration, as the temple priests and centurions come and confront Jesus, the very power of his name, I am he, causes them to fall to their knees. But instead of staying in that position, instead of choosing to worship the I am that they're just about to remember in their Passover feast, they get up and they arrest him. Judas, his friend who has walked with him for 3 years, who he's entrusted with, who he's trusted, who he's mentored and poured into, is the one that hands him over to be arrested. It's the one that betrays him. At the name of I am, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. And the power of Jesus releasing his name at that moment causes all the people who come to arrest him to fall on their knee. What an incredible moment of recognizing the Messiah. What an opportunity to recognize that the great I am, who set them free from Egypt, set their forefathers free from Egypt, is standing before them in the garden. And the place that they are standing is holy ground. With I am standing before their face. And even in the gravity of this moment, you can't help but appreciate what is actually happening here. Thousands of years of prophecy coming to a head all in this moment. The great I am, the deliverer, standing in the garden. And yet they don't recognize him. The place that they are standing on is holy ground. But you see, no one can take the king against his will. In that moment, he reveals himself as God, the great I am, the deliverer who freed them from Egypt. In that moment, we see the power of God manifest through him, stating, I am he. And there's an opportunity presented for Judas for redemption, for reconciliation. There's an opportunity presented for those coming to arrest him to recognize this is the great I am. But at the very next moment, as Peter pulls out his sword to defend the Messiah, Jesus says, put your sword away. Do you really think I will avoid the suffering which my Father has assigned to me? In this moment, Messiah, the Son of God, revealed in power, he says, but I will surrender my life to again be the deliverer, to again set you free. I will be the Passover lamb, whose blood is spread over your doorposts, so that death passes over you. You see, no one can take the king against his will. And in this moment, we see him lay down his will. among the sacrificial lambs as the covering from death for the redemption of the world. He goes willingly. He's revealed in power, and yet he still turns and hands over his life willingly. Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53, verses 7 and 8. Or actually, verse 7. Isaiah 53, verse 7. Remember, this was written 700 years BCE. And it's been removed from most synagogue readings because of the controversy. Because it describes what the Messiah would go through in his deliverance of his people. Isaiah 53 verse 7, it says, he was oppressed and treated harshly. Yet he never said a word. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. As Jesus is led away on the very day that the lambs were being prepared to be slaughtered for the forgiveness of the Jewish nation on Passover. The lamb that was signified all those years ago as they left Egypt. The lamb that they used to paint their doorposts signified the coming lamb, who also on the day of sacrifice would willingly, quietly be led to the slaughter. The evidence was undeniable. The evidence was undeniable. This was I Am standing before them. And yet, it says that they refused to believe. What will we do with the evidence before us?
Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, but Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. "You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you?" she asked Peter. He replied, "I am not." It was cold, and the servants and officials stood round a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. "I have spoken openly to the world," Jesus replied. "I always taught in synagogues or at the temple, where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said." When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" he demanded. "If I said something wrong," Jesus replied, "testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there warming himself. So they asked him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Again, Peter denied it. And at that moment, a cock began to crow.
Isaiah 53, 3 and 4. He was despised and rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with deepest grief. We turned our backs on him and looked the other way. He was despised, and we did not care. It was us who turned our backs on Messiah. I want to ask you today, as you remember Good Friday, where are you looking? Isaiah continues, yet it was our weakness he carried. It was our sorrow that weighed him down. And we thought his troubles were punishment from God, a punishment for his own sin. You see, in this moment, Jesus is being interrogated. He's standing alone. All his disciples have left except these two who've followed from a distance. And here Peter is asked 3 times, don't you know him? Didn't you walk with him? Aren't you a follower of his? And 3 times he adamantly denies, no, I did not know him. I have no part with him. And 3 times he turns his back on the great I am, on the Messiah, on the Son of God. How often how often do we turn our attention away from Messiah? How often do we adamantly say, no, I am not a follower? Maybe it's in the way we live, maybe it's in the way that we act, where we don't reflect him accurately in our lives. That is just as much of a denial of his power in our lives as it is to say, no, I do not know him. And yet it was our weakness that he carried. It was our betrayal that he carried. In that moment, Peter reflects every one of us. Whether you would call yourself a follower of Jesus or not today, in this moment, Peter reflects us. Because it's all of us who've sinned, who've made wrong choices, who haven't been loving to our neighbors or to our family members. And it's actually our own conscience that convicts us. We didn't ask to be delivered because we didn't realize how bad our sin was, how bad our sin is. In fact, we were planning, our plan is that we are going to do it on our own. We're going to deal with this. We're going to solve this. We're going to read self-help books until we deal with the sin in our lives. The general consensus is that we're mostly good people. That if we just try harder, we'll get there. But the reality is not that we're bad people. But that sin has corrupted us. Our nature has become one that is sinful. And so we were going to try and fix it on our own, not recognizing the depth of our own failing. We were going to do the work. But I want to tell you today, Jesus already did. Jesus already paid for every mistake that you could have made, that you're going to make. And he did it before you were even born. You were born into an age where grace was already extended to you. Where your mistakes no longer had to define you. He didn't do it because we asked him to do it for us. He did it because he saw where we were at, and he said, I love you so much that I will give myself for you. He loves you right where you are right now. He loves us in our denial. He loves us in our failings, in our mistakes. It's our brokenness that he carried to the cross. And he is paying for our sins, for our wrong choices. With every sin where we choose to deny him, he's paying for it and saying, I love you. It's covered. You can say that you don't want his gift. But that's like somebody... I heard a story once where somebody purchased a car. It's like if I had purchased a car for you and I'd gone to the dealership and I'd say, hey, here's the money, I'm buying this car, and I get the keys and I bring it over to your house and I give you the keys, and you can look at it and say, I don't want this car. You can take it back to the dealership. You can say, well, I don't want this car. And they're going to look at you and say, you know what? You can do what you want with it. You can make the choice that you want. It's already been paid for. It's already been paid for. Go and drive it off a cliff for all we care, because the price has already been paid. And in the same way, we have been extended grace as this incredible free gift. Not because we asked for it, not because we deserve it, but because God so loves us. You, me, your neighbor, your brother, your friend, your sister, your parents. That before you were even born, he paid the price for you to experience that kind of grace and forgiveness and mercy. Whether you accept it or not, it's already done.
Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace, because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," they objected. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. With this, he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the King of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in an uprising.
What is truth? Pilate asks. The origin of culture's response that is all too common to hear today from those who believe their thought to be all too original. What is truth? Is it my truth? Is it your truth? And yet here before Pilate stands, I am. Jesus' response is to stand in silence, as though to allow the silence to speak on his behalf. That it would whisper out, "Here is truth. The way, the truth, and the life." Here before Pilate stands the one whose very nature is truth. How often before us doesn't Jesus stand there as the one who is truth? And we look to the left and to the right, saying, "Where is truth? Is there a third option?" And he stands there silently, as if to say, "Here I am." Truth stands before you today. And yet in his standing there, he surrenders his will. Having undeniable evidence to his nature, he still chooses to allow himself to be interrogated, to be arrested, to be accused. Here before Pilate stands truth. And yet how often do we, just like the crowd, choose that we would rather have truth hung on a tree and the robber and troublemaker set free? In his place, to have Barabbas. How fitting that in this encounter it would be truth that would die on the cross so that a troublemaker would be set free. That he would willingly lay his life down for one so unworthy as me. Make no mistake, Jesus was put to death because he clearly claimed to be the Son of God. You can see it in John 19:6 and 7. And yet he did it so willingly. So every one of us, troublemakers, sinners, and lawbreakers, would be given life and freedom. That truth would stand before us and say, "I will take your place. I will pay your price." Isaiah 53:5 and 6. But he was pierced for our rebellion, crushed for our sins. He was beaten so we could be whole. He was whipped so we could be healed. All of us, like sheep, have strayed away. We have left God's path to follow our own, yet the Lord laid on him the sins of us all.
Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. Once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, "Look, I am bringing him out to you, to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and the officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify! Crucify!" But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him."
See, traditionally, at the time of Passover, the Jewish people would remember with one of the elements called matzah. Matzah is a type of bread, it's an unleavened bread, and when God commanded the Israelites to remember their deliverance from the promised land, he said, "Make your bread without yeast. Make it without leaven. Don't let it rise." It was to remember their flight, their escape, their exodus from Egypt and the hurry that they had to be in to encounter God's deliverance. But it's also symbolic. You see, every year around Passover, the Jewish people cleanse their home of any kind of yeast. They go through and they clean every corner to make sure there is not even a trace of yeast in their lives. And yeast is a representation of sin. And so this bread was to be without yeast, just as the Messiah was to be without sin. This incredible reflection that they had taken part of year after year was directly pointing to the Messiah. This same bread was stripped and pierced to keep it from rising. In the same way, the Messiah was stripped and beaten. And though they thought they could keep him from rising, he still rose on Easter Sunday. You see, there is a consequence for sin. Our conscience condemns us in our wrong choices, in the times we don't measure up to what we think we should be doing. And there must be a consequence if there's to be justice. In order for you or I to experience forgiveness and to enter into it, there has to be payment for sin. But the incredible thing is, this payment was made before you or I ever made our first wrong choice. It was to be our consequence. By our denial, it was our consequence. And yet, as Isaiah said, he was beaten for our transgression. It was his punishment that brought us peace, where we could be welcomed into the family of God. It was our rebellion for which he willingly gave up his life. And how true don't those words of Pilate's ring? Here, he is your man, the one who would take away the sin of the world.
The Jewish leaders insisted, We have a law, and according to that law, he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God. When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free. But the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, "Take him away! Take him away! Crucify him!" "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered.
You see, in that moment, the religious leaders whose main goal was to defend the honor of God denied their king, saying, "We have no other king but Caesar," the very Caesar who had enslaved them, who had conquered their nation. There was no love lost between the Jewish people and Caesar. And yet in that moment, to prove a point, the religious leaders shouted, "We have no king but Caesar." The man who was beaten and bruised, who willingly gave up his life, and they stood there and said, "I want no part in the payment that you're offering." What is your response today to the payment that Jesus is offering to pay for you? How will you respond at the presentation of "Here is your King"? What will you hold dear?
Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus. Carrying his own cross, he went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There, they crucified him. And with him 2 others, one on each side and Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city. And the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. The chief priests of the Jews protested to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man claimed to be King of the Jews." Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written."
See here, the religious leaders, the ones who should have recognized the Messiah, who had pored over the scriptures, who had studied them over and over and over again. They missed their deliverance, and even Pilate was saying, "Here is your king." He put it on a sign over his head, not to be missed by anyone. Someone from the outside recognized Jesus as king. Where are you in this story? When somebody from outside recognizes Jesus as king, where are you in your response?
When the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes, dividing them into 4 shares, one for each of them, with the undergarment remaining. This garment was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. "Let's not tear it," they said to one another. "Let's decide by lot who will get it." This happened that the scripture might be fulfilled that said, "They divided my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment." So this is what the soldiers did. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clophas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother there, and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, here is your son." And to the disciple, "Here is your mother." From that time on, this disciple took her into his home.
Isaiah 53, 8 and 9. Unjustly condemned, he was led away. No one cared that he died without descendants, that his life was cut short in midstream. But he was struck down for the rebellion of my people. He had done no wrong and had never deceived anyone, but he was buried like a criminal. He was put in a rich man's grave. In Matthew 27, Matthew recounts the death of Jesus, the crucifixion.
They came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. There they offered Jesus wine to drink, mixed with gall, but after tasting it, he refused to drink it. When they had crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots. And sitting down, they kept watch over him there. Above his head, they placed the written charge against him. "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." 2 rebels were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God." In the same way, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders mocked him. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him. For he said, I am the Son of God. In the same way, the rebels who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him.
And as they mocked the Messiah, hanging on a tree for my sin, with the very words of hell, as though the devil himself was mocking Jesus hanging on the tree, thinking he had won over the Son of God, that he would remain in control. But what he didn't realize is that in a few short days, that Jesus himself would make a mockery of all the principalities and rulers in the spiritual realm. That he would take them as captives, leading them in a victory procession, marking their defeat. You see, it says that for the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross. When he was looking at the cross, he said, I will endure that because of the joy on the other side. You are that joy. He looked to the other side of the cross and he saw you. And he said, I will go through all of this suffering and all of this pain if it means that they get to be free. If it means that I can have relationship with them, that I can interact with them, and they can come into the Holy of Holies and be part of the family. That you and I can be called sons and daughters of God. Jesus looked at that and he said, that brings so much joy to my heart that I will willfully endure the suffering on the cross. The beating, the bruising, the mockery. That the King of Heaven would choose to endure those things because he saw you and I as such a source of joy. That he saw your freedom on the other side of the cross. He saw your sonship on the other side of the cross. He saw that you would be co-heirs with Christ. And to him, you are worth it all.
Later, knowing that everything had now been finished, and so that Scripture would be fulfilled, Jesus said, I am thirsty. A jar of wine vinegar was there, so they soaked a sponge in it, put the sponge on a stalk of the hyssop plant, and lifted it to Jesus' lips. When he had received the drink, Jesus said, It is finished. With that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Now it was the day of preparation, and the next day was to be a special Sabbath. Because the Jewish leaders did not want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath, they asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. The soldiers therefore came and broke the legs of the first man who had been crucified with Jesus, and then those of the other. But when they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth, and he testifies so that you also may believe. These things happened so that the scripture would be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken, and, as another scripture says, they will look on the one they have pierced.
It is finished. At that moment, the payment for you and for I was complete. Your sonship was purchased. Your adoption payment was paid for. And if it was finished at that moment, what then is left? What is left for you to pay for? What is left for you to fix, to figure out? In that moment, Jesus said, "It is finished." And he gave up his spirit.
And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God."
You see, in that moment, it is finished. And the veil in the temple, the very thing that was to symbolize separation between God and man, was torn in half. The adoption payment was made so that we could boldly enter into the presence of God by the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And all of creation responded. We see earthquakes, we see people, the first fruits of Jesus' resurrection, where people are actually raised from the dead, because it is finished. We see people recognizing there was something significant in this. It is finished. Your freedom is paid for. Your forgiveness is paid for. All it takes from us then is to accept the payment that has already been made, to accept, as I mentioned before, the car that was purchased. To accept it. Because the payment was already made and it is finished. There is nothing left outstanding. In John 19 it says, "No one of his bones will be broken, and they will gaze on the one they have pierced," which is taken from Zechariah 12:10. And it alludes back to a story of Moses and the Israelites in the desert. And the Israelites disobeyed God, and so God told Moses, "Make a bronze snake and lift it up on a pole. And every person who would look at that snake would be healed of their disease." The Israelites had disobeyed God, and there were snakes going through and biting people, and people were dying from it. And God said to Moses, "Create a bronze snake, put it on a pole, and lift it up. And anyone whose eyes look to that emblem on that pole will experience healing. They will gaze on the one they had pierced, and he would lead to their healing. It is finished. Isaiah 53:10. But it was the Lord's good plan to crush him and cause him grief. Yet when his life is made an offering for sin, he will have many descendants. He will enjoy a long life, and the Lord's good plan will prosper in his hands. When he sees all that is accomplished by his anguish, he will be satisfied. And because of his experience, my righteous servant will make it possible for many to be counted righteous. For he will bear all their sins. I will give him the honor of a victorious soldier because he exposed himself to death. He was counted among the rebels. He bore the sins of many and interceded for rebels. In the moment of his death, as we read in Matthew 27, the immortal one, the great I am, the one who had delivered the people of Israel from Egypt in Exodus, the one with no beginning and no end, breathed his last breath. He surrendered his nature to cover our sin so that the troublemaker could be set free. So that those who were not living as righteous could be called righteous by God. That we could come into relationship and know him intimately because of what Jesus paid for. Not as one condemned standing before Jesus in judgment, but one who is called righteousness because the Messiah gave up his life for us. Covered in a robe of adoption as sons and daughters before a king. It was God's good plan to bring you and I close to his throne. Not in fear and trembling, but as children of the King. And it was a powerful moment. But it wasn't the end. In fact, it wasn't even the greatest day, because 3 days from this day, there would be something even greater that would come about. The living bread that had been pierced and stripped, that was free from sin, was about to make a comeback.
Who is God? At the beginning of the book of Exodus, surely that's the question the people had to wrestle with. Because they were a nation of slaves, waiting on God to show up and make good on the promises he made. For God had vowed to the founder of these enslaved people, a man called Abraham, that his offspring would be a great nation, who would bless the earth and dwell with him in a land called Canaan. But Abraham had been dead for centuries, and his children weren't a nation, they were in captivity. And while they were growing in number, so was their slave master's cruel activity. So, who is God when you've experienced nothing but 400 years of his passivity? Were God's promises fake? Was his faithfulness flawed? Or maybe all the stories they heard were nothing but frauds? This is the question of Exodus. Who is God? To answer this, God raises up a deliverer, a man named Moses, and discloses who he is by speaking out of a bush engulfed in flames. God tells Moses who he is by God telling Moses his name. Who is God? God is I am. As in, I am with you. I am faithful. I am listening. I am able. So as Israel was bringing all their questions to the table, like, who is God? Where is he? Will he come? Does he see? God was answering all of these by being I am to his people. I am was with them when he heard and responded to Israel's cries, and when he performed wonders and miracles before Pharaoh's eyes. I am was with them when the plagues began their takeover of every false Egyptian god, and when he provided a way for his people to be passed over by blood. I am was with them when he moved Pharaoh's heart to allow the people to flee, and when he saved Israel and punished Egypt by parting and closing the Red Sea. I am was with them through the wilderness, in fire and in cloud, and when with manna and quail he fed the grumbling crowds. I am was with them on the mountain when he made his glory and power prominent, when he called the people his own and made with them a covenant. I am was with them in the tabernacle when he gave Israel a tent in which they could dwell together, and when he filled that tent with his glory, so much so that even Moses could not enter. I am was with them because that's who God is. A God who enters into our story, working behind, among, through, above, everything in the world, just to show us his glory. Who is God? God is I am. And no matter who you are, this is a question you have to wrestle with. Who has God shown himself to be in the pages of Exodus? Because the whole world has been in Israel's position. We've all been slaves to broken hearts and evil systems. We are all oppressed by death and will fall under its final opposition. And so, surely we've all wondered, who is God? Will he fix this wicked condition? And what Exodus shows us is that God answers our petition. Because the I Am who rescued his people from Egypt rescued the whole world in the person of Jesus. Jesus was with us by becoming human as a response to our cries. Like Moses stepped out of Egypt, this new deliverer stepped out of heaven and walked by our side. Jesus was with us because the true plagues of sin and death had made their takeover. So Jesus became sin and was pinned under death so these plagues might pass us over. Jesus was with us by falling under the waves to open a path of dry ground so that we who deserve to be lost in the water like Egypt, instead, like Israel, can be found. Jesus is with us today in our deepest hungers and hardest strife, for through his Spirit and Word, he provides for us like he provided for Israel, but this time we get the bread of life. Jesus is with us as God was on the mountain with Moses, but instead of man climbing up to find God, Jesus came down and found us. Jesus was and is and will be with us, because as his body was opened, so was the tabernacle's tent, so he can make us and the world his dwelling, both now and when he comes again. Who is God? Who has he revealed himself to be in the pages of Exodus? He is I Am. He is with us. God is our rescuer. God is Jesus.
Hey, thanks so much for joining us for our Good Friday service today. We hope you enjoyed it and that it was meaningful for you. And if today you felt like you wanted to commit your life to Jesus, we want to hear about that. So please use the contact form above. Send us an email. Let us know with your contact information so that we can get you some resources to help you start your journey with Jesus. Also, we hope that you'll tune in Sunday morning. We're going to be celebrating the resurrection together. And we're going to do that at 10:30 a.m. We're going to have a service at 10:30 a.m. and another one at 6 p.m. So tune into either one of those, whatever suits your schedule best. But we want to do this together. We want to celebrate Easter together. So we hope to see you there.